G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru. Today I've got a really quick little tutorial, which some of you might know if you're a Revit user and you've been using Revit for a while, but I still teach this to a lot of people to this day. If you're doing a job that has room contents that are very important, for example a hospital, maybe an apartment, and you need to tally or schedule those contents on a room layout sheet, for example, it can be quite difficult to do this if you don't know how. There's a system that's really easy to set up once you know, and today I'll show it to you using my basic sample project, which can be found for free on my course platform. Anyway, in this case I'll be using Revit 2020, but you've been able to do this for quite a while in Revit, so most versions should work the same. Anyway, let's jump in. So this is a typical wet areas documentation sheet, which is similar to a room layout sheet to some degree. Probably contains a little bit less information than you may see on something like a hospital project. But essentially we have floor plans with fixtures tagged, elevations with fixtures and finishes tagged. And I'm using here what's called a keynote legend in order to summarize the coded elements on the drawing. Essentially, if something is coded here using a keynote, it will appear on the drawing as well. I'm going to show you a different technique today, which is how to use a multi-category schedule to actually get a quantity of elements in this space instead. So whilst we can see things like the fact there's a bath or a drain or a hook, we can't see how many of those elements there are. Now, because this is a keynote legend, it doesn't actually incorporate that functionality. It's just there to say what a code represents using a keynote file. Whereas I'm going to use a different technique here. Now, it's really important to understand that one of the most important steps in a process like this is to have well-managed data. It's very hard to schedule things in Revit if your data is messy or not set up at all. So all my families typically will contain both a keynote and also a code parameter connected to the keynote. This is the very minimum thing you need in order to schedule these elements. From there, I also have a description, which is connected to a shared parameter as well. In this case, I'm just going to use keynote and description, so we only really need those two parameters, but they do need to be consistently managed across all your objects. So in this case, my fixtures always start with F dot, and my joinery starts with J dot. So the point is that there's a dot inside all my typical codes, which I can use to filter out things that aren't relevant. As well as this, you're going to want to make sure you know the number or something unique about the room that you're going to be identifying those fixtures within. In this case, I'm going to be looking in the GF.05 room for its number, which is unique in this case to this room. So you're going to want to manage your room numbers as well. Okay, so let's just go and create a schedule to summarize these components. So I'm going to go to View, Schedule, Schedule and Quantities, and I'm going to create a multi-category schedule, which is at the top. Now, if you're using a version before Revit 2022, there are going to be less things captured in a multi-category schedule. Typically, just the loadable component families will appear here. Whereas in Revit 2022, we have things like walls and ceilings and other categories appearing here as well. So you may have more things to filter through depending on how you manage this. You may wish to break these down by category. Maybe you just want to do a specialty equipment in-room schedule, but in this case, I do work across multiple categories to capture elements with codes. So plumbing fixtures, specialty equipment, etc., etc. In this case, I'm just going to call this GF.05, so the number of the room, bathroom. And in this case, we're going to have to add some fields. So first of all, we want to know what the code of the elements in the space is. So I'm going to go down past all my shared parameters and just add keynote. We want to know what that element is in a readable description, so I'm going to add my description field. And we're going to add a really special field now, which is called count. Now, count isn't actually a parameter that exists in the elements themselves. It's a parameter that's unique to scheduling. And it will just return the number of elements in a particular row in a schedule. So I'm going to add count. Now, at this point, if I press OK, I'm just going to get a giant list of elements in my model, all, of course, with a count of 1. Now, obviously, there are way too many things here. This is not limited to my schedule. I'm seeing every piece of structural framing. I'm seeing every downlight, uplight, way too many things. So we actually need to add the room to filter by. So if you select here with multiple categories, and this applies to a lot of different types of schedules, there's actually more things you can pick from. Always check these menus when you're working with schedules because you may have much more information you can filter by. I'm going to go to room, and now we can interrogate the room properties of that fixture. Now this is going to be the room where the origin point of that family lies. So if you have elements on walls, you might have to be careful with how they report. You might need to move their calculation point further inside the room in the family's definition. But assuming that they're all inside the room, we should just be able to take something about the room, say its number, and add it as a column. And now we can see that most of these fixtures do have a room that they're reporting to. Not all of them, because they're not all inside rooms. For example, all my structural framing is in the roof where there's no rooms. But now we're going to filter. So first of all, I'm going to filter by room number equals, and I'm going to look for everything in gf.05. At this point, we've limited ourselves down to only the elements inside this room. Now, there are some things we do want to get rid of by filtering further. So for example, I have downlights, floor falls, shower screen doors, elements that aren't really relevant to the quantities inside this space. So what I can do now is just build an extra filter. Now, because my coding convention is very consistent, I get some advantages through that. I can just say, does the keynote contain dot? Now, chances are you probably weren't able to do that because your Keynote system's probably different to mine. But hopefully this is an example of a Keynote or coding system that does lend itself quite well to filtering. I could also filter out things like joinery by saying that the code either has to contain F or start with F, or does not begin with J, for example, to filter out my joinery. So it gives me a lot of flexibility. Finally, we can also, in this case, de-itemize the schedule. So currently every single element in the schedule is represented by a row. Now, if I just tick off itemize, the whole schedule just comes together because I'm not telling the schedule how to sort and group the elements. In this case, if I go back to sorting and grouping, in this case, I want to group them together by their code. So in this case, we can see now that we're going to get multiple instances of elements. So for example, now we have 2 drains, we have 2 hooks, we have 2 towel rails. So we're now effectively doing a takeoff by the room's contents. Finally, under formatting, I'm just going to come and hide my room number. We still need it in order to filter our schedule, but we don't want to see it in the schedule itself when we place it on a sheet. I can also do things like apply a view template to my schedule just to clean it up maybe. So it's a little bit more well formatted. But otherwise we could now quite comfortably take away our Keynote Legend. And instead, we could use our actual quantities schedule instead, which will summarize what's in the space, how many of them there are, and what their code is. And this is actually a much more meaningful schedule to include alongside one of these things, because now people can see exactly how many elements there are in their model. Now you do have to be very careful that the fixtures do fall inside the room, like I said. So for example, in this space, currently we have 2 hooks, a shower, a vanity sink. So I'm going to find something that's very close to a wall and I'm going to put it outside the room. So this family's origin is currently sitting on the wall. So if I look for this particular fixture, f.taco2 toilet paper holder, let's say that I've been a bit careless and I've literally just placed this maybe just outside the room. Well, now I can see it's still currently in the room, so the origin must be slightly outside there. Interesting, there's another one still there. Strange, it's still picking itself up in the room. Very interesting. The origin point must be somewhere different. Oh no, I'm in the wrong room, of course. So if I go to this room and push it just outside the wall, notice how now it doesn't actually count itself in the room. So you have to be very careful with how these elements are reporting and that people do place things accurately inside the room itself. Otherwise, it can be a bit risky because you might just altogether miss out an object in a space. Having said that, otherwise, it's a very effective technique. Notice as soon as I bring this in or out, you can see it's essentially including itself in the schedule. But you are going to want to be careful, especially with elements that might be recessed in the wall. You may wish to add a reporting point. So pretty much any family you can do this in. For example, in this toilet roll holder, you should find this room calculation point setting, which will allow you to enable this calculating point. And I can just come into a different view and I can say in this case, maybe my calculation point is out here somewhere. Now, as far as I know, you can't constrain this point. Oh, you can. Okay, yeah, you can constrain the point. Cool. So in this case, if I had my toilet roll holder just outside the room, it should still make it into the report because notice its reporting point is inside the space. And there we go. Now the toilet paper holder is probably not the best example of when you'd need a reporting point. Things like outlets or recessed niches inside walls which are going to usually be outside or just on the room, are good examples of when you may wish to introduce reporting points to your families. But otherwise, we've created an effective way of capturing a quantity takeoff of contents in a room. If you want to create another one, it's very simple. You just get the room number from another space. I'm just going to duplicate my schedule. I'll just rename it for good practice. And I'll go back to the filtering and I'll just pick a different room number. And there we go. Now I have my gf.08 as well. So you can create these very quickly once you have a template going and a standard setup. You just duplicate them, change the number, Bob's your uncle. So in this case, I hope that this has been an effective lesson for you. And that this is a technique you can take to your projects, especially if you work on hospitals. So hopefully that's a useful technique for those that didn't know it. I use it all the time on jobs like hospitals especially, in order to schedule the contents on a sheet with the views that relate to that room as well. Anyway, if you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. Thanks, take care, bye.